Hello and welcome to the latest in this series of free Leaving Cert Honours English classes which we're offering online. Today's focus is going to be comparative texts, looking at the range of texts that are available to study for the 2020 exam. These texts obviously will be relevant for years other than 2020, so if you're coming across this video at a later stage, hopefully it's still of value. A quick bit of background: I'm a former head of English. I taught in 4 different schools around Ireland with a fairly decent set of results at Leaving Cert Honours Higher grade. I'm also a writer, and the main reason why I'm doing these classes is to raise money for the charity Alone during the coronavirus crisis. Obviously their need extends beyond that, so again, if you've come across this video at a later stage, please do consider making a donation at alone.ie or visiting the website where the proceeds from the sale of any of the books goes to help that charity. So into the whole concept of the exam itself and what is going to be asked of you in the exam in terms of what you will need to prepare for and ways in which you can best address their needs and make sure that you're getting the highest grade available to you. Well, the good news is we know what they're looking for, and it's what they're looking for, as we saw in the classes on the comprehension and unseen poetry section and the composing section. It's pretty consistent. The difference in this case is that although the type of language, the quality of vocabulary, etc., that you use, your ability to use a variety of punctuation will still matter and will still be have marks awarded for it. In this case, much more so, the most important thing is that you support whatever you say with evidence. We need proof points for every point you make, and failing to provide that, an adequate reference or quotation or something of that nature will simply mean that the points you make are not rewarded and not seen as having value. But putting that aside for a second, let's talk about the things that you will find as commonalities, first of all, across all of the text on the course. In total, the students who've been attending these classes have been following or studying 19 different texts. The ones that you see on the screen are the ones that are most commonly studied by that cohort of students. And obviously one thing they all clearly have in common is they have a plot. There's some form of story. In addition, there's a narrative arc of some kind that runs through those stories, delivered either by a first-person narrator or a third-person narration, or presented upon the stage or presented on the screen. What they also have in common, obviously, is characters. Central characters, peripheral characters, characters who play vital parts within the drama itself. In some cases, the character and the narrator can be the same, or can tell you things that you mightn't otherwise have learned. For example, in The Great Gatsby, the central character is not actually Gatsby in terms of the narration. The narration is delivered by Nick Carraway, who is telling us what he knows. But what's most intriguing in cases with that book is what he doesn't know, or what he comes to know over the course of the narrative. All of the works themselves have some form of theme or message. So it's in these areas that questions around comparisons are most likely to be asked. There are things, obviously, therefore, are going to be different. The contrast that you'll find across the works. Contrasting environments, whether they're physical environments or environments of other types to do with class or culture. And they're going to have different genres, and by this we don't just mean that some of them will be plays or novels or movies, but they'll fit into broader genres such as dystopian science fiction, as we have in The Handmaid's Tale in George Orwell's 1984, or comedy, or books that have thrills or suspense at the very heart of the narrative themselves. They'll differ in structure, and again, some of those differences will be related to the form. So typically with a drama, what you'll see is a 5 or 3 act structure, and you see that reflected again in the texts that are on your course. And obviously they're going to differ very much in style. Sometimes the style will be related directly to the form itself, and we're going to talk a little about that in a little while. But also what we're going to see is that there are distinctive voices coming through in all of those works, whether they're works you encounter on the page or on the stage or on the screen. So when you look across such a wealth of different texts, one of the big challenges is, well, how do you make connections between them? It's difficult because they are so varied, but in a way that's an advantage for you as an exam student, because whatever question the examiner asks has to have relevance to every one of those texts. And when you drill down across that plethora of text, you realize that there's only a limited number of connections or commonalities. And they go a little further in actually telling you where those questions will be located. If you're facing the Leaving Cert Honours exam in 2020, whenever that will take place, you'll be asked about 2 out of these 3 things on the exam paper itself. There'll be questions on the cultural context of the works. There'll be questions on the literary genre, where we're going to be looking at style and different devices and techniques. And there'll be a question on theme or issue. 2 of these 3 things will definitely come up in the exam, and you'll have a choice in questions on either of them. So let's start with the first of those, the cultural context. And perhaps the best place to start here is to look at the whole notion of culture itself. Well, what do we mean by culture in this instance? Effectively, what we're talking about is common behavioral patterns, normative behavioral patterns, shared ways of thinking or feeling or doing. And in all cases, these works present some form of cultural background or context to the stories that are recounted. So when we look at culture in general, we need to look at across quite a wide spectrum of different things. And it's interesting if we take, for example, the 3 most studied texts out of this year's cohort, which is F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, Henrik Ibsen's A Doll's House, and Brooklyn, the movie. And what we see in each instance is there's a real broad cultural context across the spectrum of those different works. For example, when we talk about class, we have all 3 main classes represented across those 3 works. Brooklyn is focused on the working class, A Doll's House focuses on the middle class in Norway, and Gatsby focuses very much in the upper class in those interwar year societies. We also have different historical contexts. You know, if you take those periods in time, with A Doll's House at the end of the 19th century, when we encounter Gatsby, we're talking about the aftermath of World War I, that period of boom prior to bust ahead of World War II. And then in Brooklyn, we have post-World War II America and post-World War II Ireland, and the contrast between them, even though the historical context per se is much the same. We also have very varied belief systems across those works. For example, with those 3 works, we have Catholicism represented, that system of belief in Brooklyn, in Ireland in the 1950s. We've capitalism represented, both the capitalism with all the promise of individual achievement, which we see represented in the Brooklyn of the movie at that time, but also capitalism at its less attractive, at its most vulgar in The Great Gatsby. So we also see feminism as a new belief system to a degree emerging in Ibsen's A Doll's House. Now, he always denied having written a feminist book, or sorry, a feminist work, but the play very, very clearly brings to the fore that notion of female empowerment, individual agency, and control over one's life. We also see prejudices and received ideas coming through in all these books. Now, the notion of a received idea is a belief that you have simply inherited. Because your family or your community believed certain things, you end up taking on those beliefs yourself. And then they and you become part of a community of shared values. We see that again in 1950s Ireland. We see that in Gatsby with the prejudices and the ingrained behaviours or a moral code or a lack of moral code that pertains within that community as well. And central to all of these works, again, is the role and position of women. You know, it's a central concern in each case, not just because we have very strong female characters, central characters in many cases, but also because the books and the works right across the spectrum of texts that are on the course deal with the role and position of women, either as perceived victims, as people who are being repressed, or as characters who are standing up in some way and rebelling against those existing standards of belief. So one of the things it's worthwhile doing as you go through the novels and the plays and the films of Weber is to look for the things that are the same. It's very easy in the exam, and it's very easy as part of your study, to spot what is different, to see the contrasts, but dig a little deeper. If you really want to impress the examiner, being able to point out things that are the same, even if they may differ in some small ways, is actually more impressive in many cases than just pointing out what are clear polar opposites. But the good news in general is that there are 3 things you need to know, 3 things you need to prepare for. First of all, what are the cultural norms in the works that you're studying? What are the cultural norms of 1950s Enniscorthy? What are the cultural norms that pertain in the society that Nick Carraway finds himself in The Great Gatsby? What are the cultural norms of middle-class Norway in 1879, the time in which Ibsen writes his play? What you also need to look at is things such as the central character's stance in relation to this. It's the second of the most important areas. So there's a cultural standard at play. What is the character's stance in relation to that? Do they adopt that set of beliefs? Or if they do, does that change? In the course of the work, do they take a different stance in relation to it, as we see with Nora in A Doll's House? At an early stage, she's actually prepared to kill herself rather than put her husband through some form of loss of reputation or disgrace, because she believes the set of standards that pertain in that society at that time. By the end, we know she rejects not only marriage, but she rejects that set of beliefs as well at the same time. Think of the way in which Eilish in Brooklyn both embraces and abandons different sets of cultural norms at different times. She travels from Ireland to the US, back to Ireland, and back to the US once more. And on each occasion, we're given more of an insight into her view of the cultural norms in each of those two places. And that view changes. So think about where it changes, be able to provide evidence of that change, and talk about what those changes actually demonstrate about the character's development and how it helps to communicate the central theme of the author. And then at the end is that last thing. It's like, how do those norms influence the narrative directly? You know, when Eilish comes back into Ireland for her return, the compensations of the sort of life she left behind, the sense of community, are suddenly more obvious to her. And they influence her decision. They influence the plot. But ultimately, she makes a decision that she has to make a choice between sets of received behaviors and the promise of the unknown to a degree. With the return to Brooklyn. You know, think of the influence of those normative behaviors in The Great Gatsby, when there's this contrast all the way through between East and West. You know, at the end, Nick decides that he was, as a Westerner, never able to fit into the society that he described and he had spent this time within. He is at the start very scornful of the shallowness and self-interest of that society, but he's also seduced by it. Think about how that influences the development of the narrative as well. You know, why does he conclude at the very end that Gatsby and his extraordinary gift for hope represents all that is worthy of his admiration, when at the very, very start he had seen Gatsby and all of his set as something or people only worthy of his scorn? So in Norwegian middle-class society, we also see again that there's a notion of a tension between appearances and reality. Reputation is all. You know, outward manifestation of wealth, outward manifestation of control or power, of respectability, is in many cases much more important than the reality. We see in all of these works the notion of coercion and power, the notion of deceit. If you think about it in A Doll's House, the central premise of the associated bond. Well, obviously, you know, the loan that Nora's entered into also is making a nod in the playwright's language towards the bond of marriage itself. You know, in every case, what's interesting to see is the way in which rejection helps to form the narrative. In all of these three works, people reject the set of standards that they have been given or they've been asked to live under, even if at the start they embrace them, or in the case of The Great Gatsby, are to some degree seduced by them. So what is central all the way through in this view of culture, or the cultural context, is the notion of freedom. This is something that is unified all the way through the text, and it's a central conceit that is there all the way through most of the other texts and the comparative text section of the exam as well. You know, social freedom, the ability to do and act in the way you would like to behave socially the way you think you would like to, as opposed to the controls that are put upon people, particularly the central characters, by those sets of normative behaviors. Emotional freedom, you know, do people have the emotional freedom to be affectionate with those they want to display shows of love or other emotions, including emotions of anger, or is that too repressed within the society of that kind? Religious freedom, political freedom, obviously all of these things are very, very central to what's being described and the themes that are being communicated. But central to that notion of freedom is its opposite, which is duty. You know, in freedom, unless it's absolutely prohibited, as in George Orwell's 1984, also involves choice. And in this case, what we're seeing is the tension between duty and freedom and the need for central characters to make a choice. And that effectively is how all of these narratives are constructed. You're presented with a cultural context, the challenge or tensions that the character operates within. They are given opportunities then as a result of that to either obey what is perceived as their duty or to reject it. And at the end, they all make central choices. And when you think of that notion of duty, for example, it's not just a duty to obey the rules and mores of the culture, but it's duty at an individual personal level as well. Think about how Eilish is made to feel guilty that by going to America, she will be failing to look after her mother. And not only that, but she will effectively be bringing her sister's life to an end because the sister will have to take up that duty. Think of the ways in which people make choices which are not only related to duty, but related to or help to display their own moral integrity or lack of it. In fact, when Gatsby tries to protect Daisy by claiming he was driving the car which killed Myrtle Wilson, he's not actually in keeping with the set of standards or the normative behaviors of his set. He's actually going against them. You know, Tom Buchanan is a better representative of what that society's mores are really like. He goes against that, and even though we know that this leads to tragedy, it is also something that effectively redeems his character in the case of it as well. So there is no courage and no achievement in any of these works without that tension. You know, we admire Eilish for striking out on her own and making the choice she makes because it's hard. We admire Nora in A Doll's House because what she's doing is almost unprecedented. It is truly revolutionary to decide whether to leave a marriage. You know, Gatsby, in making his choice, effectively condemns himself to death. But in every instance, it's that which both defines character and also to a large degree defines the narrative. So the cultural context in all of these works is really important. And as I said, the most important thing to do is make sure that you're prepared for the questions. You know what the cultural norms are. You can give examples of when they're being displayed, or you can also outline how the character stance alters and changes during the course of the narrative in relation to that. So we'll go on to the second section, which is literary genre. Well, when we talk about genre in this instance, we're talking about effectively categories of literature. Now, in this instance, again, we can divide these by form because we have a novel, a play, and a movie, but also we look at content and we look at style when we talk about genre. And the good news, again, is because this is such a broad range of things that the examiners have already told you the specific areas they will look for you to reference in providing an answer. They look at characterization. To a degree, we've already talked about that, and we're going to come back to it again a little later. They'll ask about atmosphere, you know, the mood or tone of a particular scene, for example, within a drama or within a movie or within a novel. They look at the role of dialogue, of imagery and symbolism, how suspense and tension are achieved and maintained, and they'll also talk about the narrative voice. So they'll ask about the what, and they'll ask about the how. You need to know, you need to be able to identify those specific techniques which are specific to the genre of the work itself, but you're also going to have to talk about how they're achieved and what that effect actually is. So what we have in these three central texts, The Great Gatsby, Ibsen's A Doll's House, and the movie Brooklyn, are very, very different forms. And you can see that even by looking at sample pages taken from the published works. You know, the Gatsby, you know, Gatsby is a novel and words carry the weight all the way through. What we see with a stage play like Ibsen's A Doll's House is that dialogue carries all weight. We hear people speak, and outside of basic stage directions, that's largely how we understand both character and theme. And then a film script is very, very different again, because it is a combination of both. You know, a writer, when writing a film script, or a director in preparing to film the movie itself, will make a lot of directions. They will give indications of where they want people to be, what things they want in focus, and so on. So what it comes down to in looking at literary genre here is the split between description and depiction. Now, in a novel, it's all about description. We only know what we know based on what we hear in the words of the narrator. Now, that narrative could include an interior monologue, an internal monologue, where we hear about how the character feels. We don't just see through their eyes, but we hear about their interpretations of what they see. In many cases, that is deliberately vague. In some cases, we have untrustworthy narrators in novels, where we're actually invited not to believe what we're told or to begin to question what is being left out. In the case of a play, it's about depiction rather than description. The playwright must depict the character's internal and external lives and depict his theme through what people say. And how they do that is limited. Well, they have the actors, they have the words they speak, and they have a number of other devices and techniques available to them, such as the stage set itself, the use of props, the use of costume, the use of lighting, things of that nature. But it's a narrow canvas, and largely the depiction is brought through to the audience by what's said by the characters on stage and how they say it. In a movie, again, it's about depiction rather than description, but there's a broader canvas. You can do things within a movie that obviously you cannot do within the confines of a stage play. And actually, you can do pretty much anything. With the use of CGI, there's almost an infinite number of things you can do. It's probably one of the reasons why it's so hard to stage sci-fi on a stage. You can do pretty much anything you like, but equally that involves choices. And those choices will change how the audience receives that depiction of either character or of theme. So when we talk about this, then what we're also talking about is the weight of narrative versus dialogue. In the novel, the narrative, the central story is driven by a narrator. Whereas in the case of the film script, in case of the play script, what we're doing is we're relying on dialogue between characters. But the most important factor here actually is perspective. Now, in every instance, there's a different central perspective between these three forms of work. The perspective in a novel is the perspective of the author or the narrator, the character who is telling us the story. We're restricted to it in most cases, unless we have multiple narrators allowing us to see things from different viewpoints. But in general, we do truly see through the author's eyes or through the central character's eyes. In the case of a stage play, the perspective is the audience's. The playwright puts everything on the stage to face out towards the audience, and the central perspective is of anybody sitting within the theatre looking back down at the stage. Everything is done to control or to appeal to the perspective of the audience member sitting in the seat. In the case of a movie script or a movie as a piece of work, actually the central perspective is the director's. Now, it is the director who decides what you see. It's the director's choice on what face to concentrate on during a piece of dialogue. In fact, if the director wants, he can emphasize one person's reactions over another and alter the perspective of the viewer. They can center in on particular things, small objects in the foreshadow, in the foreground, or taking broad panoramic views of a central place. Everything is really there through the director's eyes, and that's how we receive it. So very, very different perspectives. But also then when we look at the techniques, again, the core here is not what technique is being used, but the impact of that. How does the use, for example, of a color palette in a movie like Brooklyn, where there are bright primary colors when Eilish is in America, and a palette of blues and browns and greys when she's in 1950s Ireland, how does that affect the atmosphere or tone or mood of it? How do particular incidences or phrases or scenes within the play or movie or novel help create a sense of drama or communicate a theme or help us to understand how a character is developing? And again, the key thing here is not just the technique. What you'll be asked about in the exam is that technique's effect upon. So you need to be able to identify what those core techniques are in stagecraft, in filmmaking, and in the writing of a novel. But also you need to be able to identify straight away what they do. What is the impact of using these particular techniques upon how you view character, how the story progresses, how the narrative is developed, or how the theme is communicated. Not just what is done, but when, which is your evidence, how it's done as well, and the reason for that. And then thirdly, we come to theme or issue, which is the third area of question in the Leaving Cert. Well, again, it's useful to look at a definition of what we mean by theme here, because this has to be something that's central to and true of all of the texts that are on your course. Essentially, a theme is a recurrent idea. An idea which pervades a work of art or literature. A dominant or unifying idea is also part of a description here, and it's something that is developed throughout the work. So it's a central idea which recurs, a central idea which effectively the events or the characters or the language or the scenes that are depicted on the stage or the screen help to underline. And the challenge here, of course, is, well, how can we communicate theme or ask questions about theme when the works themselves are so varied? In preparing for the exam, what they must do is to centre on themes or issues which are relevant to all of the things that are available for you to choose as your sources for your comparative text study. So reality is that there are three different types of response in terms of theme and issue for each of two sections. First of all, there are the subjective responses to theme, questions which ask you, for example, how relevant do you find the theme or issue in a novel such as The Great Gatsby to your own life? They're asking for a personal response. Now, of course, they're not really interested in your personal life. That what they will still grade you on is your ability not just to make your point, but to back it up with proof that demonstrates a knowledge of the text and also allows you to do that in a language which is going to be of a sufficient order and a sufficient quality of expression and elegance that they can award you marks for doing so. So they'll ask you how relevant a theme is to your own life or your own experience. How convincing you found the communication of that idea, how impactful that theme was for you as an individual. And then there's three other areas they will look at, which are about objective viewings of the text themselves. Did you find that the central message or idea in the text was essentially optimistic or pessimistic? Well, if you think about a novel like Orwell's 1984, when the final images of a boot stomping on a human face forever, we're probably not going to say that that's a fairly optimistic worldview. We also have that dichotomy between whether a theme is perceived as realistic or idealistic. In many cases, books set out to give you a better view of the world than perhaps is true. But if they are not realistic enough, then that can detract from the communication of the theme or the conviction that is being imparted. And again, you may be asked whether you felt it was successful in communicating that central theme. Again, that's not about a personal response. In this instance, you need to be able to point to what was done, said, took place, described, etc., meant that it was successfully achieved, whether they managed to communicate their idea in a successful way or not. So when we look again at things that are central, when we talked about the cultural context, we saw that these were key concerns throughout the works that are on your course. The notions of freedom and antithesis, which is the notion of duty, and how characters within the central works have to make choices in order to have the option of social, emotional, religious, political freedom, the freedom, in other words, to do, to say, to be what they want to be. And when we look at this from a thematic point of view, we find that the same things are common. Those central notions of freedom, choice, or duty are there all the way through. What's also central all the way through, there's no doubt, is that all of those works deal extensively with the issue of women, their agency, their independence, and their struggle to be respected and heard. And if you look at the range of strong female characters across those texts, Eilish, Nora, Catherine and Kathy in Wuthering Heights, Offred in A Handmaid's Tale, all of these are characters who are either depicted as powerless or as depicted as developing strength, developing convictions, and standing up in a way that is seen as laudable and to be celebrated. I wouldn't be surprised in the wake of the Me Too movement to find that this becomes a focus of questions in this year's Leaving Cert exam in 2020. It didn't really show up last year, which was a surprise, but I think this year it would be very, very unusual, particularly given the text that you've been offered to study, if the notion of women's role within society wasn't something that was examined. Now, the reality is that, whatever the setting in all of these works, whether that's 1950s Ireland, whether that's America, either in the interwar years or in the 50s themselves, or whether it's bourgeois, middle class Norway. In every instance, what we're also seeing is what we're seeing is the works of art there to expose hypocrisy, to reveal the essential truths about that society, about those belief systems, and also about a person's character. Because ultimately, what we learn in all of these works is that we are what we do. As F. Scott Fitzgerald put it, action is character. when he was asked about which was primary in terms of creating a novel, was it more important to have the plot, the narrative as the central thing, or the character? His answer was that action is character. In other words, what we do ultimately is what we are. And that's what we see running through all of these books. It's by making their choices and taking the actions they take that they define not only who they are, but they effectively communicate the central theme of the work itself. Whether that's Tom Buchanan telling George Wilson that Gatsby was driving the car that killed his wife, exposing who he is, but also exposing the mores of that entire society, or Torvald telling Nora that she's dishonest, immoral, unfit to be a mother when he thinks that she's compromised his reputation. He can try and walk that back, as he does afterwards, but he has told us who he is, but he's also told us what that society is like at the same time. At the end of all of these works, we see people rejecting narrow belief systems. We see people standing up as central characters against what they are expected to do or what they're expected to be. And that central theme is the thing I expect that you're going to be asked to look at and to develop in the questions that are going to come up on the exam. So they're the three key areas, as we said: the cultural context, the literary genre, and the key theme or issue. At this stage, what I would suggest to you is, in your preparation, stick to those three works that you've been studying for this period of time, but make sure you are armed with that proof. The more detailed the reference you can give, then obviously you're doing two things. Number one is you're demonstrating that you really do know your text. The other is you're preparing language to bring in with you that will gain you a high grade, because those things still matter. The quality of your vocabulary, your ability to vary punctuation, your ability to be eloquent in your expression is as important as what you say. How you say it is always, in the Leaving Cert exam, as important as what you say itself. Now, at this stage, we'll pause during the live class for a Q&A. One of the questions I did get that I'll address here quickly was whether it was right to deal with all three texts within a single paragraph or break it out. In general, my experience would be that there's never any harm in having multiple small paragraphs rather than a small number of large ones, because the whole point of the exam is to draw attention to every point you make. You want the examiner to see everything as a distinct point, which is worthy of having marks awarded for it. So don't worry if you end up with lots of small paragraphs. I would worry if you felt that you'd gone into the exam and some of what you'd said had not been heard, because a very important point that you'd made had become lost within the body of a large paragraph. So space it out as best you can. If you have other questions, then I would suggest then just go to the website, pop it in the comments section, and I will do my best to get back to you. That will stay live. And lastly, if you're looking at this video during the coronavirus crisis, just a reminder, stay safe. Do not stay isolated. Yes, we have to be socially distant, but stay in touch with your friends. It's a very, very difficult time to be stuck at home. That in itself is not great when it's on top of the stress of facing an exam. The comment section, as I said, is on the bottom of the website. You can see the website address at the end. And then finally, before closing, a reminder that I'm doing these free classes and recording these videos as a way of helping raise money for the Alone charity. If you go to www.alone.ie, you can make a donation there. They are in trouble, because most of our charities in Ireland are supported by people standing on street corners taking donations from passers-by. That's not happening. Or from regular sums that are being donated to them through online sources. A lot of those things aren't happening either, because people are worried about their own welfare and their own finances. So if you can, if you found this of value, please go to alone.ie and make a donation there. As I said, if you buy any of the books that are on the website, the proceeds from those are also going to Alone. And with that, I'm going to leave it as a close. This is the fourth of the free classes we've been doing. There will be two more, and I hope to have a chance to speak with you again.